Everybody, Bobby here from the GM Table, and today we're doing another book review, and this time it's one I personally have been waiting quite a while for it to come out, Exploring Eberron by Keith Baker. Now, this is a weird situation of a book, before we get into it, of it's not an official Wizard of the Coast release, it's a DM's Guild release, but it's written by Keith Baker, who created and writes the Eberron setting. And this book is both the size and production value you would expect from a Wizard of the Coast production, which means while it's not official and it's definitely not going to fly for something like Adventurers League, this is as close to an official release as you get without it being official. Before we get really deep into the book, I want to say that the first 205 pages of this 250-page book are fluff. Just non-mechanics, things about the world and the races and the planes and all of this fluff. And if you followed the show, typically I notch down books for this, but I want to explain something because this isn't a core book. This is a supplement. And I don't cover a lot of supplements, so it could get confusing. When it's a core book and the first 200 pages are fluff, it is a huge red flag for me because I want to be able to just get into the mechanics and whether or not this book will be useful for me at the table. Eberron, 5th edition Eberron, has already proved itself whether or not I care about it at the table. Supplements, I think, are a great place for that fluff and delving deeper into ideas and concepts and lore and all of that. So I'm actually fine with it here, especially since it's interesting fluff. It's not dry. It's not the same thing you've seen a million times. So now we can actually get into the book proper. Chapter 1 of the book opens with the exact kind of fluff I actually do tend to hate. So I do want to bring this up because chapter 1 is timelines and history, and it's basically the entire history of Eberron, bring up to the now, the assumed now, given this is a role-playing game where you could play anytime you want, but now. Anyways, chapter 1 is not a big part for me, but it's only about 25, 26 pages. Going on from there, though, we then get into chapter 2, where things start getting a little more interesting, where they start delving deeper into the races of the world. Mainly stuff that they just didn't have time for in the core book. This, again, isn't my thing, but I appreciate it, and again, in a supplement, this is what I expect, and it's all very well done, even if it's not the stuff I tend to look for. Chapter 3 is where things start getting interesting for me, personally, because this is where they delve deeper into the religions of Eberron. And honestly, for most of your fantasy settings, typically this would be like the races chapter for me, where it's nice, it's useful, but since I do a lot of homebrew, it's not really for me. But the thing is Eberron is a fantasy setting that looks at religion drastically different than most other fantasy settings. And delving deeper into that is something I personally find very fascinating, because religion in Eberron, in a world where the gods are absent but their power is there, and whether or not the gods exist is even up for debate, not that they did exist and they left or anything. Whole concepts are actually debatable, and characters can have theories and philosophies, and you can get a lot more nuanced in it. So having more depth into the different religions and their histories actually really matters. And for me personally, it really helps in looking at different ways to build religions in a fantasy setting. Then chapter 4 picks up the pace even more by exploring the parts of the world that basically had to get ignored in the core book. Mostly areas ruled by monstrous races. And this is where it can get into the very interesting take on goblins and goblin kind in Eberron, which I do appreciate. Because, again, just like with the religion, I care about this fluff if it actually brings something new to the table. And it's not basically the same thing 5 other books have already done, just my unique take on it. We then move into chapter 5, which is still heavy into the fluff territory, but chapter 5 is where it's my kind of fluff, because this covers the planes of Eberron. And this book does a thing that many books screw up on. They cover a bunch of different regions, but they don't gloss over any of them. All the planes in Eberron are already very unique, and the cosmology is different than most other D&D universes, so it's already something I find interesting and worth looking into, because it's going to be different takes and different spins on things. But more importantly, each of those planes has 4 to 5 pages devoted to it. Each plane has enough detail, enough written about it, where it's not so much that gets dry and bogged down, and there's handy bullet points of things that will matter to you running adventures or campaigns involving that plane. I don't want to say the mechanics because it's not crunch, but they're bullet pointed in things that will matter in how you design stories. You design your own mechanics around it, but they're also not just, oh, here's a couple pages per plane and we're done. One thing that bugs me more than anything, if you're going to get into covering large swaths of things like all the planes, and I have like 5 pages of fluff, and those 5 pages is a bunch of 2 to 3 paragraph descriptions of each one, where none of them go deep enough in for me to use it. And it's just, well, here's some ideas, but nothing that's actually usable. This is deep enough where I can use it, and I can really sink my teeth into making those matter in game, or stealing them from my own homebrew, without it being so bogged down that it feels like reading a textbook. Finally, we get 200 plus pages in, chapter 6, part of the book I care about the most, part of the book I'm sure a lot of people care about the most, the character creation rules, the new mechanics for the game. I'm not going to go into every single piece of this, but I am going to do some highlights because there is so much cool stuff in this book. First thing we get is new backgrounds. We get 3 new backgrounds. I'm not super impressed with any of them, especially since each of the backgrounds tied heavily to different cultures that are now explored within the book. But I want to give an honorable mention to this. I want to say how much I appreciate it, because one of the things that really bugged me about Eberron Rising from the Last War was they had backgrounds, quote unquote, but there was one background, and it wasn't even that interesting, because honestly, if you're going to only have one background, it better really wow me. And at that point, it's like, why even bother? Just save that background for something later on. Did you just add it to feel like you had backgrounds, but you only provided one? That's not enough to give a feel of the world. This fleshes that out, extends it, lets us feel more like there are background options that fit within the Eberron world. But once we get past that, we get to go into the class options. And the very first thing in the class options is you get 2 new Artificer subclasses. Artificer really needed a couple more subclasses, just because since it's Eberron specific, it doesn't have the advantage the other classes have of things like having Xanathar's Guide to give even more options for players. But also, pretty much all the options in Rising from the Last War for Artificer were you have some kind of buddy, whether it's your mechanical beast companion or your cannon and things like that. This gives very different options. You have 2. One is devoted to weapon crafting and weaponsmithing and basically being on a quest to make the perfect weapon. And the other, the one I personally really care about, is they label it as the Jack of all trades Artificer, but it is the casting focus Artificer. It is all about being able to swap out spells on rests, getting spells from other classes, kind of like the Bard does, and really being a powerhouse of magic, though it's an Artificer, so a powerhouse of inventions, and just shining in that side of things. So if you felt like the Artificer didn't have enough casting potential with it, this book really does a good job of giving you the options to make your casting focused Artificer. There are also new Artificer infusions. I will be honest, I'm doing broad strokes here. I could probably do a whole video about all the new Artificer stuff, but there are new infusions. We also get 4 more subclasses that aren't the Artificer. We get 1 for Bard, 1 for Cleric, 1 for Druid, and 1 for Monk. Again, I'm not going to do full breakdowns of these. The Bard one is interesting, but nothing that really wowed me. The Cleric, however, is basically how to do psionics as a cleric, which I love because it's just using the magic system, but it reflavors everything to be psionically focused. So if you want a psionics character, again, this book does it. There's a mind cleric, and boom, all of a sudden you have a psionic character. The druid is amazing in this because it's another shape-changing focused druid like Circle of the Moon. However, it's all about changing into construct versions of beasts, which means you can do some fun stuff now with these rules. And then finally, the monk, which the monk has its whole thing. Again, another thing I could do an entire video about, but it is the way of the living weapon. And this one I compare most to the Totem Warrior Barbarian, because every few levels you get a list of options to take, and each with their own theme. Way of the Living Weapon's actually like 4 monk subclasses that you get to mix and match a la carte. Again, not getting too deep into it, but it lets you do things like have stretchy arms to punch with reach and spend ki to reach even further. It can let you shape change and get claws that deal bleed damage. It can turn you into the tankiest monk you've ever seen by becoming more like a warforged and get basically adamantine skin. All kinds of cool shit. Honestly, the best way to sum up most of these new class options is they're just rad as hell. Chapter 7 also brings in some new races. In fact, we have 7 new races or sub-races, and most of them are actually goblinoids from these new lands we're talking about, which are interesting, and it gives you secondary takes for goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears. It gives a way to play gnolls that aren't just they eat everyone, which is interesting. But the one that really shines to me is the new rune-bound dwarf, because these are dwarves that have delved themselves so deep into symbiotic based technology that they have a symbiote living inside of them that they get to use and have as like a little buddy. If you want to sell me on a book, give me some stuff that's just straight up weird. And this is awesome. Chapter 7 is what you would kind of expect with any Eberron book, a bunch of magic items. Now, as expected, there's a bunch of common magic items, but more interestingly, though a lot of those common magic items are actually really cool too. But interestingly, is you have magic items that work for specific dragon marks, which is something I love. It makes dragon marks way more interesting and just completely fits within the world. I know within the novels for Eberron, these items already existed. We now have them for 5th edition, or at least some of them. We then have rules also for Sybaris dragon marks, which are dragon marks that the GM gets to award as actual rewards. I get to give out dragon marks basically as like boons. And there's rules for if a character already has a dragon mark and you give this to them, compared to if they don't have a dragon mark and you give it to them, and all kinds of cool stuff with that. And then finally, within the gear section, they also have symbionts, which are the symbiotic items, mostly weapons, but there's all kinds of other stuff. And yes, these are symbiotes you can get as loot or gear. And again, give me something weird to add to my games, and I'm so happy. This is so freaking awesome. Finally, the last chapter is chapter 8. This is the Bestiary, but don't expect a massive tome of beasts. It's only a little over a handful of new monsters, but most of them are big bads above CR 20 monsters, including a few of them which are Fey big bads. And I love me some Fey nobility as big campaign-based villains. So it's not a huge section, but it is this nice little area to give other places to go within Eberron with their own big villains to base campaigns around. So that's it. I try to do this quick because it's like 4 a.m. I just finished with baby duty. So I'm trying to rush through this. I wanted to give this as full of a review as I could. But if you haven't figured it out already, I recommend getting this book. I will warn you, the PDF is $30. If you get print on demand, it's about $65 for a hardcover, high quality printing plus the PDF. And the thing is that this is a book of both the size and production value of something official. So I'm not too surprised about the price is a little high for DM's Guild item, but I'd say it's worth it for something like this because you're not buying some fan-made thing. You're buying a supplement made by the creator of the setting, and they didn't cheap out on it. This feels like a Wizards of the Coast book. In fact, if you ask me, it feels like it's a book that's better than a lot of the Wizards of the Coast books. Anyways, if you made it this far into the vid, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Join our Discord community to get involved with all the things we do around here. If you want to help support the channel so I can do things like buy $30 PDFs, we have the link to the Patreon, as well as you can check out our live shows on Twitch, which is where we also have audience participation for tips and rewards. So there's all kinds of stuff to get involved with us. We'll catch you guys next time. Bye!